Hello, I'm Ed Gatsky, and this is a presentation on presentations that I made a few years ago when I worked at the Center for Teaching Excellence at USC. I've updated it periodically, but it's basically about doing presentations using PowerPoint. So a lot of us use PowerPoint for making presentations, but a default presentation is pretty boring, not very appealing. It's just black text on a white background, and if you can do a lot better, you can do a lot better without putting a lot of time and effort into it if you know some of the tricks. But you still have to be clear when you're presenting information. So PowerPoint can be pretty distracting if you start playing around with it. My daughter, when she first got a hold of PowerPoint, she just went to town with all sorts of craziness. And I had a colleague that gave us a presentation, and every slide was a different color, and it was very difficult to watch going through slide to slide. And I couldn't pay attention to her science because every slide had a different crazy color. And it doesn't always translate well to your presentation. Some people can't see some colors, and it may look great on your LCD. I had another colleague that came and he gave a presentation that looked like this, black on dark blue. And he said it looked great on his LCD, on his laptop. But when you went into a projector, it just came across terrible. So these are mistakes I've seen to avoid, and I'm giving you demonstrations. Red and green color blindness. Apparently 8% of males are red-green colorblind, but only 0.5% of females are colorblind. So try to avoid red-green for important information. It can potentially cause a lot of trouble for some people in the population. I think there's some studies I've seen, women sometimes have a mutant chromophore, tetrachromophore. They have extra color depth perception. My wife and I played some of those games online, and where you have to organize stuff from light to dark, different shades of a color, and like they're all red, and she can like organize them and get them 5 times better than I am. So just saying, watch out for red on green, or red and green together. It doesn't always work well. My history with PowerPoint. I came to interview at USC in 1999, and PowerPoint totally destroyed my presentation. It was a font issue back in the time. And I still had a transparency, so I busted out the old transparencies and overhead. But that's pretty bad because everything I do pretty much is equations. So that didn't work well, and I'd seen that happen a lot at conferences. Research conferences, there's usually software issues, hardware. So, I've seen people stand up with a 12-point, just basically a copy of a paper, and paragraph after paragraph. It's impossible. It's not really a presentation. It's just showing you my paper and talking about it or reading it to me, which is sort of a silly way to use a presentation, I think. So there are a lot of different ways people have failed with hardware and software at presentations and conferences. Sometimes a 15-minute session, 10 minutes will be spent trying to get the laptop to work. I've taught the junior lab in chemical engineering, and I made a list of things to do in your presentation, and then every round of presentations the list gets longer on stuff to do and not do. So things I would never creatively think of. The list was, after a few years of doing this, the list is pretty well enumerated, but sometimes people are very creative in how they come up to making presentations. And I had a lot of trouble with the new PowerPoint, and I had a student embarrass me a few years ago. When they went to the tab, the new format for getting to access instead of the old way of accessing tools, the ribbon stuff. I avoided doing it for like 5 or 6 years. I eventually had to jump into the new PowerPoint and learn the interface. So we'll go through some basic stuff you probably know, and give you some suggestions on stuff that can make your PowerPoint a little bit better, and I'll end up with a couple of examples. So Slide Master is one of the first things to look at. This lets you set your theme instead of using a default PowerPoint theme. So a lot of the PowerPoint themes aren't appropriate, I think, for typical presentations. I try and keep my font size around 20 or 24 point. Text location, I want to make sure I have a default PowerPoint has smaller text boxes. So I like to make sure I have room for a 2-line title, and I like to change the footer locations and change the content location to blow it up so it's bigger. And I put a little color on our image on every slide, and I use that for my template, playing around with Slide Master. So if you have a problem, you can always use a blank slide or just a big white rectangle and drop that to the back of the slide so that can become a white background if you need to get rid of all that stuff on a slide. So if you go to Slide Master, if you've never done this, spend some time playing around with it. You can get your default slide and start editing what it's going to look like, so that way you don't have to edit every slide. You basically just change the style in your Slide Master and use that, and it will give you a lot of formatting, a baseline formatting for your presentation that's nice and consistent. So this is a template I've been using for students for a while. So a nice big title, 36 point, subtitles around 20 point, 28 and 24. I try and avoid sub bullets, but 28 and 24 usually works. Your bullets are typically not sentences, and I usually capitalize just the first letter. If you have an image, you might have small text that talks about where you cited that image from. A little bit of color to separate your title and your content, a little bit of color to separate the footer out, maybe an image in the corner. So this is a template I give to a Maymaster class where my students go to Germany and talk about energy, and I give them a template to fill in to work on putting some of their presentations together. So when we put the presentations all together, they're somewhat consistently formatted. Try and be consistent with font sizes and capitalization. It makes you look a little more professional. PowerPoint likes to change sizes on you automatically. So you can turn that off, but it'll shrink stuff if it doesn't fit very well. So be aware that it might not be consistent. And try and use PowerPoint drawing tools, because a lot of times imported drawings from Paint or Word or other applications may look terrible. It's the difference between vector graphics and raster graphics. So a lot of times the PowerPoint tools, it doesn't take long to reproduce almost anything once you figure out how to use the tools in PowerPoint to your advantage. You don't want too much information on a slide. They used to tell us growing up that you want 3 or 4 concepts or ideas on a slide. More recently, I've heard every slide is 6 by 6, 6 lines with 6 words. So that's basically dialing down your presentation so it's not just overloaded with too much text. You got to learn how to do outlines and bullets that get the idea across, and then you fill in the sentences. You don't have to use full sentences on things. You need to be able to use bullet ideas. Transition slides, I like to use those like an outline so that you know you're going to finish a talk at some point, that you're making progress through a talk. And you may want to play around with the quick access toolbar. So I use a lot of subscript, superscript, zooming, and equations. So I put those customized in my PowerPoint so I can get to them very rapidly. And there's a little trick a lot of people don't know. If you're using the arrow keys, items in PowerPoint, well, if you're trying to move them with the arrow keys, they'll jump around on a grid. But if you hold Control and use the arrow keys, they'll move just a tiny bit. Using a mouse is not very accurate, but if you're using Control and the arrow keys to move something, you just move it just a tiny, just a pixel or two. It's a very, very small amount typically. So much smaller than trying to do with arrow keys or a mouse. So I had to put in some stuff on aspect ratio. The old school aspect ratio is 4:3. So 4:3, the width of a TV, and that's basically what this presentation is. The modern widescreen is 16:9 for 4K resolution, or 1080p or 4K. The new widescreen TVs typically are about 2:1 or so. I like using 4:3. If I'm going to be careful, very, very conservative, I still use 4:3 for my aspect ratio, because when you stretch it out on a widescreen projector, you get black bars on the side. If you take a widescreen presentation and you end up somehow with a 4:3 aspect ratio, you get black bars on the top, and it squishes your content down. So you actually shrink stuff. So if you know exactly where you're going to present, maybe use widescreen, but still to me, 4:3 seems like a safer presentation. So you can, that's adjust. If you want to adjust that, go to the design tab and change slide size. That's a typo. I can't spell adjust apparently. Motivation. There's an old book or a presentation in the New York Times, article in the New York Times, PowerPoint makes you dumb. People have studied this, make publications on the cognitive style of PowerPoint. There's a Swiss political party I found out that tried to ban PowerPoint because people would spend so much time playing around with it, with animations and art and doing things instead of just actually getting content together. Scott McNeely banned PowerPoint in the 90s. So they went to hand-drawn slides because the engineers and computer people were spending too much time playing around with PowerPoint to make pretty presentations. So people have done some studies. Students don't like busy slides, stupid, dumb clip art that's just sort of ridiculous. transitions and animations, templates with too many colors and stuff. So basically relatively simple stuff is what students like to hold on to. They like that they have graphs and visual learners. Some people like to have visual instead of just text. Bulleted lists, though, they do help you organize your ideas, so it keeps professors from rambling on too much because they're stuck with their lists they've already put in PowerPoint. So you have a structured, nice lecture. But graphs and pictures usually help. The verbal explanation for graphs and pictures helps the students. So visual learners, graphical learners, those kinds of, it takes more time to do that. So just putting it's easy to put a bunch of bullet points together for a lecture, but getting visual illustrations is key to getting better student understanding. So here's my outline slide. I like this little trick. I put my outline together and then I blow up the part I'm focusing on and gray out and shrink down the part I've already done or I'm going to get to later. So we're moving on to some of the more advanced stuff, a little bit of animation suggestions, some SmartArt and images. So three of the little bit more advanced stuff in PowerPoint you might want to consider. So for animation, it can be very useful. But if you have too much information, you want to stage your information and you can slowly reveal stuff. But it hinders navigation. So if you have to click 7 times per slide, it's going to slow you down. And it can be annoying if everything is going to appear. The student, whoever's watching your lecture is waiting for the next thing. And it can bother them if it's distracting or done in a bad way. And it can fail terribly between versions. I had a student bring in a Mac version for a presentation, and he had spent a lot of time with animations to get equations to appear, and with a Mac version, when it came to a PC, just vomited equations. It was terrible. I had another friend, he didn't understand animations very well. This is in grad school, one of the smartest guys I knew. And he didn't really, maybe he was just seeing if he could do it, but he had a PowerPoint, a whole 20-minute presentation with one slide. He just made everything appear and disappear. So one slide with everything layered on top of it. It's a little bit crazy, but it worked, sort of. It just took a long time to set it up. Remember, there's also a shortcut. If you're in the middle of a presentation and you have to jump out to play with video or play with software, you don't have to go through the entire, click through every single slide to get back to where you are. Your current slide, you can just hit Shift F5 and you might start on that correct slide from right there. So one of my tricks is a multi-slide animation trick. Make a perfect slide as best you can, make a bunch of copies, and then delete stuff, which is easier. Maybe it's easier than grouping stuff and having it appear and dealing with PowerPoint to time everything. So this is a little trick. Maybe it's not a good trick to use. Maybe you just want to use regular animation. But what does that mean? This is a slide that a student gave me. And it's a little overwhelming. There's just too much. You pop that up like, oh my gosh, I don't know where to look. But if you get that slide and you're happy with it, you start out, you talk about, here's our little electrodes or whatever this reactor thing's doing, and then we hook it up to something and this to this, and color coded. It shows the information flowing into the system, and we have to have these auxiliary equipment to do something, and we have some other stuff hooked in. We have some separate equipment, and when you talk through those 5 different points, now people follow sort of what you're putting together. You're not overwhelmed initially by seeing too much information. So staging information is important, and you don't have to, you can just go ahead and group things and have them appear in PowerPoint if you feel pretty good with the animation. But it's easy just to make 5 or 6 slides and delete the stuff you don't need, put them in the right order. Now, a student originally came to me, she gave me this. This was her schematic for that piece of our unit operations equipment. And I have no idea, I guess she was trying to show this presentation, but it I think wasn't very clear. She went on to win the student presentation for her research awards because we worked together on some other PowerPoint stuff. I wasn't a research advisor, but I gave her some pointers on PowerPoint, and she actually won at the Discovery Day for USC that year. This is a research slide that I use for my research. It's basically, we're talking about solving a mathematical problem. So trying to take a complex mathematical problem to put it into illustration, and then showing how that problem is iteratively solved over and over as it changes from one step to the next step. So it's basically animation, but it's animation going from one step to the next step to the next step, and it tries to motivate and explain in general what the mathematical computation is doing for the problem. There's another area you may want to investigate. You can insert SmartArt. It's a PowerPoint object. And I had learned about this a few years ago, and this was a new one for me. And they have things like the horizontal bullet list. So you don't have to make all the blue blocks. It will give you some ways to present information that is visually different, so it can break up a complex or just a talk that just, instead of being bullet points and bullet points, you can do things like the horizontal bullet point list. They have Venn diagrams, but Euler diagrams are actually what this is. So all you have to do is you don't have to make the circles, you just type in the text. So it'll format everything for you in PowerPoint. So it could work really well for you. I know to nitpick, Venn diagrams require all sections, all intersections of your actual different sets. So there are 4 set Venn diagrams, 5 set Venn diagrams where every single possible combination of 5 is shown, 6 set, 7 set, and why stop there? I think there's even a 12 set now that they've put out there, but basically every single little individual possible combination of all the different sets is there somewhere in a diagram. So it's a crazy Venn diagram, not an Euler diagram though. SmartArt lets you do things like a process, like you don't have to put all the blue circles, you just have to type the text. And it's very easy to modify and add inputs and outputs. So you can have multiple outputs, multiple inputs, and it will just basically you do the text and it does all the graphics. Cycles here, so you may have some sort of cycle. And again, you don't have to do the little arrows. Copy paste, you add more arrows, move things. It's very easy to modify this without you having to spend all your time drawing curvy arrows. Timelines work. You can put things in and organize it. And again, all you have to put in is the text. But sometimes it is difficult to get it to look just like you want to. So if you want to take it and then make modifications, sometimes it's tricky. So if it works for you, it works really nicely and it's very easy. If it doesn't, it may be a headache. So it's got a little bit trade-off to doing SmartArt. Now you can always go into PowerPoint and just look around. I think they've updated tons and tons. They keep adding more and more templates for SmartArt. So lots of ideas. I think it's online too, so it'll download more templates as they come available. So it's grown over the years, and there's a lot of different PowerPoint SmartArt options there for you to look into. Images. So I went to a presentation on presentations years ago, and they're talking about how images are really important because they're inspiring, motivating, but you got to be careful with rights and citations. You should typically, if you borrow something from the internet, you should cite it, the URL, maybe a shortened form so you don't have the entire long URL. If you can get access to stock photos or some free stock photos, that's something you could use in your presentation. So PowerPoint is not the best for image modification, but there are some tools that will help you a little bit. You can double click, Alt print screen. If you know how to, on a PC, you can print screen, or there's a screen grab command now. I think it's Alt Shift S. You can get a screen grab and crop, or you can click on an image and double click on an image in PowerPoint and take the crop option to pull in the corners and cut out the background. So you can plagiarize images off the internet very easily nowadays, but try and cite your sources. It's good form to do that. There's a remove background tool. So I'll show you an example of using both of these. So you can print screen, copy your entire desktop, everything on your desktop, and then you can paste it into your presentation. And then you click on that image, double click on that image, and click on clip, and you can pull in the black corners and the sides to resize your image. And eventually, crop. So you crop your image down, and once you've cropped your image, you can blow up that image and you can actually see part of the whole screen and focus on what you actually want to use. So in this case, we're using the cropping tool inside PowerPoint to quickly crop an image. It takes seconds once you know it's there, and it's just a double click and then select and then start dragging the corners, and you've got your image cut down to the more interesting part that you can blow up. So here's me drinking an adult beverage in Germany, in Baden-Baden. Now, the image remove background tool doesn't always do a great job. It focused on my face, but then it took everything away, including my body. So you can go back and you can add and subtract parts of the image. So I put my body back, even my hand. So that looks a little weird though, holding nothing. It's still pretty obvious that I'm holding something. But if you copy and flip, now I have two left shoulders in a terrible image. It's not Photoshop quality, but you can quickly get something that looks almost okay for a presentation. So a typical boring engineering slide would look like this. Not too bad. It's got some data. It's got an image. It's okay. It works. It's not bad. It's not terrible. It's better than a lot, but it could be maybe more interesting. Again, the presentation on presentations, they suggested go more to just image and text, or even very limited text and talk. So this is more like a TED Talk kind of approach to presentations. Typically, we're not going to be given TED Talks. I think maybe that's a little bit over the top. Just having bullet points with some images, putting some images in to keep your interest, it's not a bad way to go. So images are very good, but you still need to have content, and content, having it written for people that aren't listening or can't listen for some reason. Maybe they're not at your presentation, but they see your slides. I was always taught that your slide should be self-standing. If you're not there to give it, people should still get the basic information off your slides. So here's another example. Now, the problem with the image remove tool here, you might notice I removed the background behind the windmill, but you can also see the background behind the windmill. You can see through that the sky was actually blue. So it's not a great image removal tool. It's probably not a great example, but I'm just showing you some of the issues if you do image background removal. Contrast is a problem. If you're using images, don't put text on an image typically. It might be difficult to read the text inside an image depending on contrast. However, kids today have figured out if you have white block text with a black outline, it sometimes will work okay for your images, especially if it's big and capitalized. But generally I don't think it's a good idea to put text on images for the most part for professional presentations. So last, I'm going to close with a few examples. Start with a couple of disasters. Challenger shuttle disaster. They had a briefing. So this is like an old school presentation. And one of the key points was buried at the bottom in a whole bunch of a complex list. The key point was way at the bottom and overwhelming load of text. Maybe that should have been the single slide or a lead off. Hey, something's very, very much a big issue. Columbia shuttle disaster. So this is a test response presentation. What is that? Not a bullet point or sub-bullet, sub-bullet. It's the fourth level down. Test results show that it's possible at sufficient mass and velocity. So a fairly key point is buried in a very, very busy PowerPoint 4 levels deep. So I had a student that went off and worked for GE, and his boss asked him to make slides for the CEO because he was good at making presentation slides. And he had some slides. He let me borrow them to show off what he came back to talk to some graduate students in a class. And he came back, and I realized later that some of his slides were using some of these tools. So I'm like, oh, that's a beautiful teeter-totter seesaw kind of approach for things, trade-offs. And I'm like, when I realized I saw this is an example slide from him. It's just a piece of SmartArt that he used for his application. And he had talking about business, and it looks some words to talk about to help you lead the discussion. But then the background images, it's just a bunch of images with the background removed, stacked together. And then, it's 4 different things talking about details. It's just SmartArt again, with a couple of images added in. Or bullet point lists from SmartArt again. So these are just example slides that I thought were a pretty good job. At the time, they were innovative to me because I hadn't seen this application of SmartArt. Another text, limited text with a dramatic image where the background was removed. It seems to work pretty well. So if you flake out and you don't listen to the text, you can always look at the image, I guess. Sometimes, again, graphics can help if you're trying to use figures or charts or diagrams. So people are visual learners. Instead of giving us more bullet points, try and give us that experience or that visual image that will stick with us. Try and find available materials. So the university may have materials, or professional marketing, if you see something you like, be inspired by it. So possibly borrow or use similar sources of inspiration. I'm in been faculty advisor for the Gamecock Toastmasters Club, so they have lots of people that work on branding. So why not just use theirs as an inspiration for going forward if we're advertising for Toastmasters? Or USC has a whole bunch of templates that we often will use because we have a public relations marketing department that puts that together and does a professional job setting up the template. I've had students try and use Word. There's a drawing tool in Word. I don't know why they get stuck using Word for drawings, but a lot of times the diagrams that they end up with are not so good. So try and avoid using other services or other software for making diagrams. You can do a lot better with PowerPoint native tools. And this is the example with all the equations. They were supposed to be staged, but instead a poor student brought his slide in and had like all these equations, blah, 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 blah. They showed up and some were overlapping. It's just very confusing. Felt sorry for him. I don't think this will work, but you can embed video. There's different ways to do it. You may want to test it out. I've seen it work on your laptop, then when you plug it in the projector, it doesn't work. So sometimes it can be a headache to show video. So put the link on there. Sometimes you have to click on the link. Sometimes it just depends on how you set up. Now I've had pretty good luck inserting video, inserting online video even, so you don't have to have the video file locally. You can have it remote. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Now, usually I discuss active learning. If you're a teacher or trying to get people interactive, it's good to have questions for class, but people just sit on their hands. They don't usually interact in most student settings. Traditionally, I use iClicker questions. So I would get pushback from the students because the clickers, the hardware they have to buy has gotten very expensive for a little piece of plastic. Recently, I've been giving out a Google Sheet, which is free. I'm just trying to get feedback from my students to see if they understand the concepts. I give them a URL and they select the same stuff using their phone and it costs them nothing. The other thing I try and do in my class to keep them involved with the PowerPoint is give the presentation, but don't give all the information. So the important equations, they have to fill in the blanks. So they write some and listen some and they can take notes. I don't just give out the entire presentation. They have to write down the key points. They usually don't realize that the next lecture, all the key points are in the next lecture as a summary. So if they missed them, they'll see them again. But basically, it helps you with active learning. If you're writing stuff down, it keeps your brain engaged instead of just zoning out when you're watching a presentation. I added on some information. Everything works on Mac PowerPoint last time I tried it. So screen capture is a little bit different, double clicking images, I mean, all of it's there. For the most part, but it's just interface changes. It's not consistent between PC and Mac, but all the same tools are there. There's some same SmartArt, so you can have gears that interact. You don't have to make the gears, you just size them and put your text in there. Background tool, I grabbed this on a Mac and it worked just fine. So if you want to get just the image and get rid of the words, you can deselect stuff. So it seems to work just fine on the Mac last time I tried it. So your mileage may vary, maybe Macs are better than PCs for you, but basically PowerPoint will work the same. It's very predominant in a lot of industries. Everybody seems to have Microsoft Office. So things to think about: doing animation, SmartArt, dealing with images, adding videos. The thing that the take-home message for me is avoid disasters. Make sure it works. Make sure you get your content across. Black text on a white background works without being too colorful, and it'll present typically pretty well. Keep it big enough for the blind people to see it and limit the amount of information. All right, so if you have any questions or comments, please email me if you want to. I have a university addresses too as well, but I put my Gmail address on there for this one.